Hello, everybody, and welcome to our latest webinar in the Sage Politics webinar series 2026. We apologise for the very slight delay in the start of this webinar, but we're delighted to have you with us here today. My name is Fawzia Eastwood. I'm a marketing manager at Sage for the Politics and International Relations books portfolio. I'm a cisgender woman of South Asian background. I have dark brown hair, brown eyes, and olive skin, and I'm wearing a black and white dress. My pronouns are she/her. Today's webinar and panel discussion is called Teaching Concepts as Windows into International Relations and Global Politics, presented by Felix Berenskötter, author and editor of Concepts in International Relations, published by Sage. He is joined by Somdeep Sen and Tanya Alberts, who each wrote chapters in the book. Before we start, I'd like to share some webinar housekeeping information with you, please. I'm pleased to be your host and convener of today's webinar. My colleague Amy Douglas is the technical host and is facilitating the event. We're recording the webinar. However, we have switched off the cameras and muted the microphones for all participants except the presentation and the hosts. This is so that everyone will be able to enjoy the session without background noise. The chat box won't be available for the panelists, for the participants during this webinar. If you do have questions, we're delighted to address them, and please write them in the question and answer box that you'll see when you look towards the bottom of your screen. We'll reply to as many of those as we can during the session. And please do take advantage of our presenters' expertise and focus any questions you may have around the content of today's webinar. As mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, and we'll upload the recorded video on Sage's YouTube channel shortly after that. We'll also share it via email and on our social media channels. Sage Books is on LinkedIn, so do follow us there if you aren't already, and just search for us at sagepub.com. We've made closed captions available for you during this webinar, so do switch those on if they're helpful for you. A little bit about Sage. Today's webinar is brought to you by Sage Books. Sage is a global academic publisher of books, journals, and library resources with a growing range of technologies to enable discovery, access, and engagement. Our mission is building bridges to knowledge, supporting the development of ideas through the research process to scholarship that is certified, taught, and applied across all fields of social science. Whether you're preparing to teach a course, conducting research, or looking to publish your next research paper, our Sage Politics and International Relations portfolios provide top quality, easy to access materials to help you make the best use of your time and excel in your field. I'd like to just speak a little bit about the next slide, please. And we're delighted to introduce today's webinar, which will be presented by the Concepts and International Relations editor, Felix Berenskötter, and chapter authors Somdeep Sen and Tanya Alberts. They will refer to the book during this webinar. So you can find out more about the book at our website, www.sagepub.co.uk, or if you scan the QR code, that will take you there too. Attendees of today's webinar can get 25% discount using the code SAGEAUTH25, or if you're a lecturer, don't forget you can request an electronic inspection copy. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today. Felix Berenskötter is Reader in International Relations in the Department of War Studies, King's College London. His expertise is in international theory and concept, with a focus on questions of identity, security, power, temporality, and friendship. His empirical work deals with the politics of European security and peace, as well as Germany's relationships with the USA and Israel. Felix published widely on these topics. He also co-edits a book series on international theory for Bristol University Press. Somdeep Sen is an associate professor at Roskilde University in Denmark, and his research focuses on questions of race, racism, colonialism, and indigenous rights in international relations. He is the author of Decolonizing Palestine, Hamas between the Anti-Colonial and the Post-Colonial, from Cornell University Press. He is also the co-editor of Detours, a decolonial guide to Palestine, which is forthcoming from Duke University Press. His writings have appeared in the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera English, Jacobin, and the London Review of Books. Tanya Alberts is a professor of law and politics at the Department of Transnational Legal Studies, VU Amsterdam. Both in teaching and publications, she focuses on the interplay between politics and law in global governance and questions of interdisciplinarity. Currently, she's working on the history of the Peace Palace, deep seabed mining, and the aesthetics of international law. She's a co-editor of the book series Voices in International Relations of Oxford University Press and the European International Studies Association. We're very delighted to have them with us today. Welcome to you, Felix, Somdeep, and Tanya, and over to you.
Thank you, Fozia, and hello to everyone out there who is listening. Thank you for taking the time. So my name is Felix Berenskötter, and I speak to you from East London today, where the sun is shining. And I thought I start this webinar by giving you a bit of background about where this book comes from. It's been quite a journey that started in 2021, 5 years ago. So that is basically when I assembled the authors for this book on the right, Concepts in International Relations, a New Introduction. But the roots really go back much further to 2012, I think, when I first agreed with Sage to edit a book on concepts. And that is the cover of the book you see on the left-hand side, Concepts in World Politics, that appeared in 2016. Now, the reason I mention it is because I had taught Introduction to International Relations, and I had researched on various subjects, and I have always took a particular look at the concepts I was using, and I was giving my students a lot of tasks to engage with the key concepts that the theories are employing. So when Sage approached me, I said, great, I don't have a book that introduces students to concepts. So I edited this first book, Concepts in World Politics. But there was a bit of an experiment, to be honest, because at that time, studying concepts wasn't really popular in international relations. And while it was a great journey and the contributors produced excellent chapters, it didn't really come together as a textbook. So it was sort of a first step, but it wasn't quite the sort of textbook that maybe Sage wanted, but I never could conceive at that stage. Now, it was really well received, and then Sage followed up, and I decided in 2021, at the tail end of the pandemic, that okay, fine, let's do a proper textbook. And that is what you then see on the right-hand side, Concepts in International Relations, a New Introduction, which was published in November last year. And that really came also at a time where I felt that a textbook that really focuses on concepts is very timely for probably two reasons. First, I could really see that colleagues were getting tired of teaching the isms. I could also see that there was a growing recognition on the power of concepts and using concepts in the classroom as a focal point. Then there, of course, was also the sort of sense that we are in a world where international relations as a discipline is not dominated anymore by an American perspective. So there was an emergence of new conceptual language. And finally, I realized that we do need a book that provides what I thought are really good pedagogical tools to get students interested in theory, but also understanding the power of concepts as political tools, and for students to understand the stakes of using concepts in one way or another. So that's sort of the background and what drove me also to invest 5 years of my life in getting the authors and the chapters together in this book. Now, why concepts? So I think what is important is that, and apologies for my voice, I'm coming out of a cold. Why should we focus on concepts? I mean, this is sort of a question that for students we need to ask when we introduce them to this approach. But I think it is quite clear that concept is something that intuitively we understand matter because they're all around us. There are all these categories that name, delineate, and give meaning to the world that we live in. These concepts enable us to understand the events, the relationships, the actions, the processes, and they shape the way we think about the world and they guide actions. And I think this third point is particularly important because it isn't just that concepts give us a language, but they also guide our way of thinking and seeing and acting in the world. Now, this is not something that is an insight that is limited to students of or scholars of international relations. I mean, this is an old insight that we find, from linguistics to philosophy to all kinds of social sciences, humanities. We know that concepts matter, right? But in international relations, we have a particular, I would argue, domain in which so-called basic concepts play a central role in our social political language. And these basic concepts, such as war or peace or the state or the economy, they're not things like the table or a desk or a house, something tangible, something that you can touch. In international relations, we use much broader categories, and these categories are really categories whose meaning we often take for granted. Yeah. So what this book does, it uses this notion of basic concepts that the historian Reinhard Koselleck introduced in his work many decades ago. And we adopt this to the realm of international relations. And we argue that for this book, each chapter unpacks, provides students to a sort of a guided and accessible entry point into unpacking this basic concept that we are looking at. And one way to make students understand that these basic concepts are everywhere is to think about them operating in three different domains. The first is really that concepts capture everything we see, we study. So their work sort of as frames, right? Frames that help us understand what is out there. I gave the example of war, which can be understood in different ways depending on your experience or where you're positioned. We can use all kinds of frames that show us the world in different lights. A second way to understand the power of concepts is to see how they operate as sort of focal points for political movements. They define the aims and agendas of political organizations, of parties, of governments. There can be aspirations such as peace or justice, even sovereignty as an aspiration, right? Most useful maybe for IR is that concepts work as building blocks. And useful here, I mean that they're indispensable really for understanding how theories come together and how they work. Yeah. So the sort of way we can think about concepts or the relationship between concepts and theories is to say that concepts are the building blocks really of our theoretical houses, or a different metaphor if you want, they function as keystones in our theoretical narratives. Yeah? And often they do so in our assumptions. So often they're not even questioned, right? But we're all familiar with, the key terms that these theories use as their baselines, whether it's, rationality or security or power. And without these concepts, these theories don't really work, right? They're really at the center, they hold them together. Their work as keystones, anchors, whatever metaphor you want to use. Now, what is important, and I think this is where the book really provides something that also students will find very useful, is that normally we sort of close down the discussion around our key concepts by providing core definitions, right? And that's something we all do because we need to define what we're studying. And in order to go on, we cannot constantly question the meaning of our core concepts. However, in doing so, especially if we have a definition that comes from a source of authority, we tend to take these meanings for granted. Yeah. So what happens is that we become attached to certain definitions of any of the key concepts. And by doing so, we not question anymore, where are they actually coming from? Is there an alternative way to understand this particular concept? And this is really important because concepts are not simple or singular in meaning. Instead, they are vague, they're complex, and that makes them inherently contested. And again, I mentioned before that in international relations, in particular, the concepts we use are not easily visible and tangible. We cannot touch them. But there are concepts that help us see and bundle together multiple elements, aspects, and experience in one thing. And yet still, these definitions that we then use are unstable. They contain multiple meanings, and they can really only be defined in vague and quite general ways. And that makes them open to interpretation and hence open to contestation. Now, let me give you an example, and I think we're probably all familiar with, international relations as a sort of state-centric discipline. And when we think about it, we say, right, we know what the state is, of course, in this state-centric perspective. It is something that is enshrined in international conventions and practices, but often we go back to Max Weber's very influential and famous definition, which says that the state is the community which holds the monopoly over the legitimate use of physical force within a particular area. Now, this definition is important, it is powerful, it is influential, but if you look at it carefully, and I always do this with my students, then we see that the key terms in this definition, such as community or legitimacy, or even the particular area that we often assume to be in territory, they can be interpreted and understood in various ways. So even this definition, which seems to provide us with a pretty clear and powerful understanding of what the state is, can be contested and debated, because each of these key terms can be understood to be open and quite vague, and by themselves are key concepts that we can discuss and disagree over their meaning. So even if we agree on this particular definition of what the state is, we can have disagreements. But we need to ask, is this actually the best or only way we can think about the state, its nature and its purpose? And again, you can see in this example that, students easily then also come up with different answers. Sometimes they say, no, well, what about the state who also provides education or healthcare or what have you? Services or important understandings of what the state is supposed to do or supposed to be for us that are not captured in this definition. Now, once we understand that even prominent definitions from a source of authority can be questioned, then we see suddenly that defining and choosing a particular meaning of a concept has stakes. Yeah? And our choices of these basic concepts, how we read them, always moves some aspects of the world into sight, and it moves other aspects of the world out of sight. And in doing so, we as analysts, as scholars, as students, we also organize and reproduce social relations in a particular way. Right? Now, that means fundamentally concepts are not innocent. They're not innocent analytical tools, and they are not innocent sort of linguistic categories, but we need to understand them as political. Now, what are the implications of that? The implications are, number one, that we can use concepts to make students understand that the way concepts operate in theories is different. So we can have the same concept, let's say the concept of power, and we can see how it is taking on a different meaning in different theories. If you compare, for instance, the way a realist theorist would use the concept of power and a feminist theorist would use the concept of power, maybe at the face of it, you think they're talking about the same thing, but they don't. Yeah? The meaning of power is very different depending on whether you use it in a realist context or whether you use it in through a feminist framework. Which also means that it is not so easy to necessarily for them to speak to each other simply because they use the same term. Okay, so what this does is it helps students to realize that these concepts are entry points into different theories, but that actually they do something very different within these theories. And then the question arises, of course, why? So they start to understand the way the theories works, the logic works, and the way the concept operates differently in different theories. So it is a way for students to access theories, but it is also very important for students who may not be interested in theory to understand that the sort of terms they use to study very prominent popular topics, such as the rise of China, really depends on our understanding of the key term, in this case, China or rising, right? Then, because what does it mean for China to rise? Yeah? Depending on our conception of rising, we evaluate China's trajectory differently. We probably think about the relationship with the United States or with its neighbors differently. So there is a lot at stake in our understanding of what it means for China to rise. Yeah? It is not an innocent or straightforward conception. So we need sensitivity to these concepts, even in our sort of non-theoretical analytical approaches to world politics. Finally, we can see that, and again, this is not difficult for students to grasp in the first instance, that political actors like to use concepts for their agendas and for political purposes. Yeah? And it is really important for us to be able to study that. We all can see how US President Donald Trump wants to be seen as the president that brings peace to the world, right? He's been obsessed with getting the Nobel Peace Prize, and he really likes to talk about his agenda as one that brings peace. However, of course, we see him also being involved in and starting wars and using violence. His administration is, many probably would argue, not necessarily a peaceful one. So the question then arises, what role does this concept of peace play in Donald Trump's political agenda? That is a really important question that we cannot simply dismiss as mere rhetoric. Yeah? And you can think of other examples, other political actors using different terms. Another example is, for instance, why does Russian President Vladimir Putin, why was he so hesitant to use the notion of war when he started the invasion of Ukraine? Interesting question. Everybody else called it a war, but in Russia it was forbidden to talk about this being a war. So that really interesting questions of the sort of political role that concepts play in the discourse driven by state leaders and other political actors. Right. Now, one key message of the book, and for anyone who studies concepts, is that a concept is not the same as a word. So how do we study this? Yeah. And one of the things the book does is it provides a tool for students to see a concept in discourse, in practice, inscribed in material reality, in many contexts. Yeah? And the way the book does this, it takes this notion of the concept web from Reinhard Koselleck, but really you can see, very similar sort of conceptions are used in linguistics. And it basically suggests that a concept gains its meaning in a relationship to other concepts. Contrasting concepts such as war is the opposite of peace, cognate or similar concepts. For peace, you can maybe take harmony or calm or comfort, I don't know, and supporting concepts that are quite important and that play a really important role in shaping the meaning of the concept, as you could see with the example of the state earlier, where I talked about community and the legitimate use of force. Sovereignty is another important supporting concept for the state, for instance. And the way the concept is defined helps us then also see it even if the term is not used. So once we have a sense of the concept web that we're looking for, we don't necessarily always need to look for the actual word, but we can see the concept as operating also without necessarily even studying discourse. Yeah. Now, what this means also, and this is quite interesting for students especially, is that if you change a cognate concept, if you change a supporting concept, you also change the meaning of the basic concept in the middle, right? So if you, for instance, if we stick with the state and if we change the way we think about the state as something that isn't about providing sovereignty and protecting territory, but providing healthcare and education, we use different supporting concepts. Similarly, if we have contrasting concepts like war and peace, if we change the meaning of war, then this affects the way we think about peace. because if you change the meaning of the contrasting concept, this has implications for your basic concept. Okay, so this is a tool that students can use to see and study different meanings of concepts floating around in all kinds of spaces and contexts. Now, in the book, and I'm almost done, and I'm happy then to hand over to my colleagues to talk about how this actually works. In the book, what we do basically is we say, right, let us study how these concepts are used in two domains, in the domain of academia and in the so-called real world. Yeah? So we use the notion of concepts as categories of analysis that function as keystones of theories or as frames of global issues, as I mentioned earlier, and categories of political practice where they sort of frame and guide practices, shape political agendas, work as aspirations for political movements, and so forth. And all chapters basically look at concepts and the use of concepts in these two domains and how they connect and interact. Now, within that, they look, and not everybody does this comprehensively in the same way. I gave authors quite a bit of freedom to kind of demonstrate the relevance of concepts in each of these domains. But we can think of them as having a conservative or coercive nature. The way they can be used in critical ways, or they can be creative. And so in a way, what this 2x2 table does, in terms of provides you with another analytical map that helps you to systematically study and see concepts to understand how they're used. In that sense, what the book does is it provides teachers and students with a tool to also explore concepts that are not covered in the book. Yeah? Because, and this brings me to my final slide, while the book covers about 20 concepts that we think are relevant and important to understand world politics, of course, choosing 20 concepts was not easy. If I had unlimited page numbers, I would have probably had 30, 40, 50 concepts. And the question of which one to take out, which one not to put in, was often quite painful. So, of course, there are some concepts here that you might think are missing. But the point of the book is not to be comprehensive, but to provide you and the students with the tools to then go off and engage whatever concept you are interested in, right? Now, I think I talked enough, and I'm really happy to hand over to my colleague, Professor Tanya Alberts, who will tell you a little bit about how she engaged with the concept of her chapter, namely sovereignty. Tanya, over to you.
Thank you, Felix. So my chapter starts with Arctic sovereignty, and actually every chapter starts with such a concrete opening example. So in my case, there is some animation going on that I wasn't aware of. But in my case, it's Arctic sovereignty. And I show in this first story how different stakeholders use different interpretations of sovereignty to make a claim to the Arctic. Moreover, I show how these definitions enable them to mobilize different legal regimes to further substantiate their claims. So I approach sovereignty as a political legal concept, and I do so throughout the chapter, which, by the way, is also available open access on SAGE's website if you want to have a look. The next slide, please. In the introduction, I present sovereignty as something taken for granted, as well as essentially contested. And I discuss how it's challenged at different levels, which are then elaborated on in the real world use section. Yet, even though it's challenged, it still orders political reality, and it also very critically is a mindset through which we still look at the world. Each chapter then discusses the emergence of the concept, which in my case leads to a discussion of the Westphalian model, 1648. But I discuss it not as the historical birthday of sovereignty, but as the model through which we still understand the concept of sovereignty. And critically here is the internal-external divide, which I further discuss in the throughout the chapter in terms of inside-outside and inclusion-exclusion. So whereas I start with this, what you could say maybe the basic definition that a lot of us are familiar with from Hinsley that discusses this internal-external dimension, I then go on to, in a sense, deconstruct that definition throughout the chapter. The next slide, please. Yeah. And this inclusion, exclusion, inside, outside comes back in the real world section, which again is a section that every chapter has. And in that section, I discuss the link between sovereignty and the standard of civilization. Later on in the theoretical section, I come back to this standard of civilization with the English school perspective on the expansion of international society. So just to show that there's these threads throughout the chapter. In terms of contemporary real-world use, I discuss various political, empirical, and normative challenges to the Westphalian model. And in terms of the normative challenge in particular, I discussed the tensions between sovereignty and human rights and how this is, well, I shouldn't say solved, but how this is dealt with through a reconceptualization of sovereignty through the responsibility to protect concept. Each chapter also has boxes to showcase particular uses of the concept, and my first box is the Universal Periodic Review, in which I show how this process is a way in which the United Nations tries to reconcile its core principle of sovereign equality with human rights, which are usually presented as being in tension or opposites, and through this procedure or ritual, the UN has tried to find a way in order to solve this opposition. Next slide, please. In the theoretical section, or I believe the title is Academic Use of the Concepts, I discuss how different IR theories conceptualize sovereignty. I zoom in particular on realism, the English school, constructivism, and post-structuralism. And here you see how I formulate their conceptualizations, either explicit or implicit, of sovereignty within their theories. And in my second box, I discuss the practice and the difficulties of measuring sovereignty empirically. And the next slide, please. In my conclusion, I start by formulating a number of paradoxes. But after reading the chapter, it should be clear to the students how sovereignty can be all of this at once or at the same time. And these paradoxes then illustrate the work that concepts do and why they cannot be equated with definitions. And as such, I believe is in line with the overall message of the volume. Thank you so much. And I hand over to Som, I believe.
Yes, Som, you're next. Som's chapter is on race, so go for it.
Okay, if you can click one more time, I guess. Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, and it was a real pleasure to contribute to this book that provides this important primer into into this topic of concepts, and in recognition of the fact, as Felix was saying, that concepts can be political tools that shape how we see world politics happen and where we see it happen, right? So it's in that spirit that I approach the concept of race. And the first step in the puzzle for us, the way I approached the chapter, was to demonstrate to the students that race is indeed a concept that's relevant for global politics. And keeping in mind the age bracket of our students, I chose to start off with Black Lives Matter as a movement that was a powerful movement, a milestone in, global struggles for racial justice. And looking at the specific history of the movement in the United States, obviously it pointed to the racialized history of policing, racial hierarchies, racism, slavery, and a particular American history. But in the beginning of the chapter, I also try to show how there was also a global impact of the movement. And yes, the same message about race, racism, and policing traveled to places like Brazil and the UK, but it also tapped into other political struggles. You had indigenous rights groups. Protesting or taking the streets or being inspired by BLM in the US to talk about discrimination, settler colonialism in Australia. You had, activists protesting against caste-based discrimination in a place like India. So, in this sense, in weaving in all these examples, the point was to show students that race is indeed an important scope or a useful tool for understanding how hierarchies are established in the global order and also experienced. Next slide, please. So where does it come from? The chapter then moves into talking about, the history of how race started being using, or the conceptual history of the conceptual its conceptual history, looking back at 18th century uses of race and looking at both, the use of it as a biological concept, but also seen as an outcome of social and cultural and political environments. But seen together, it establishes how race became this important node for establishing global hierarchies, for justifying eugenics policies, but also providing the rationale for imperialism. Next slide. And here again, to our international relations students, here you have the real life worlds of race. Where does the discipline of international relations or political science fit in? And it's important. It was important to demonstrate to the students that the academy wasn't detached from this real world making of hierarchies, but it was deeply implicated in the structures and processes that sought to establish a racially hierarchical global order. International relations as a discipline was party to it, and we see this already and the chapter goes into some of the earliest monographs within the discipline that very explicitly talk about the cultural, the intellectual hierarchies and the intellectual superiority or the cultural superiority of the white North, of the Euro-American space, and the inferiority of the what they call the darker corners of the world. And these kind of justification, this became the scientific, in some of these books, became the scientific basis for what they say controlling the tropics, of recognizing that these are resource-rich parts of the world, but that they need to be dominated by the culturally and racially and intellectually superior global north. And in some ways, these texts helped establish, and we have this text box in the chapter, what Du Bois talks about as the global color line, a racially divided global order. Of course, this is not just a matter of the past. And in the chapter, we also show that, even when race is not mentioned, there are subtle evocations of race and subtle and hidden uses that many of the more recent revival of the race and racism literature in IR talks about, where subtle notions of intellectual superiority, of adaptability, of modernity, development, all these notions have implicit in it certain assumptions about a hierarchical global north and a much more a backward southern corners of the world. Now, again, going back, well, we started with the real world and then moving into the academic use of the concept. The chapter then pivots back into showing the applicability of a concept like race through real world examples. So the first example that we use is in terms of the political use of race, is the migration crisis, or the so-called migration crisis. In the book, there is a text box that looks at race, racism, and Brexit. But more generally, it looks at, we unpack the construction of the figure of the migrant in xenophobic, anti-immigrant discourses as this racialized figure that becomes a microcosm of all things we are not: cultural backwardness, lack of morality, education, whatever it may be, conceptions of rights. So race becomes, even when subtly used, race becomes a way of understanding why these discourses find resonance, and how these discourses help furbish already established hierarchies in a global order, or refurbish what Du Bois talked about, the global color line, that is a racially divided global order. Next slide, please. The other example that we dig into, and tragically, just as the example of race and migration is relevant today, so is the utility of race in understanding, the global war on terror. And because I'm a little bit older than some of the students who'll be reading it, an important political orientation for me was the global war on terror, and how the discourses, post 9/11 discourses, helped establish a Manichaean worldview divided between the West and the non-West, divided between forces of good and the axis of evil, and how in this discourse there was a construction of this pathological evildoer, this brown Middle Eastern looking man who was the symbol of radicalism, fundamentalism, but antithetical to all the values that we here in the civilized world hold dear and hold dear. And this racialized conception of the world divided between good and bad, between the with the brown Middle Eastern looking man on one side and the target in the global north, help once again establish this and justify this hierarchical conception of the world. So in the end, the chapter ends by, underlining that yes, there are these, real world applicability of a concept like race, but it also underlines that besides the academic commitment, there's also an ethical commitment to dealing with questions of race and racism, because it's not just about structures and histories. It's also about everyday experiences of a large majority of the world population. And it is an ethical to introduce or think about race in our study of global politics or international relations. It's also an ethical commitment, because if we don't do that, then we are overlooking the lived experiences of a large portion of the world population. So, thank you.
Great, thank you, Som. And before we go into the Q&A, I just want to put into context that I think these two concepts that we just heard about, namely sovereignty and race, they also represent two very different concepts in the field of international relations, because sovereignty is considered to be sort of a long-standing, traditional, prominent concept in IR, whereas race, and some you mentioned briefly in one of your slides, is sort of more of a hidden and forgotten concept that now has become more prominent and sort of re-emerged in our analytical sort of understanding of world politics. And I think the book is trying to do exactly that. It tries to sort of bring together both concepts that have been long-standing and established and that we think we're all familiar with, and those sort of newer concepts that not only have made a comeback or have been even newly constructed. And the book really suggests that it doesn't matter whether it's an old concept or a quote unquote new concept. We need to carefully look at how they use what they do in our analytical frameworks and in shaping political dynamics in the real world. So in that sense, I think the two concepts that you presented also nicely showcase the sort of variety of what the book is trying to cover. So yeah, I just wanted to conclude with that, and happy to now move to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Felix. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, Som. That was very, very interesting and illuminating, and hearing about those chapters. So we're getting some questions coming into the question and answer box, and the first one is for whoever would like to answer this. So it is, what is your vision on the usage of the concepts by the movie makers? Practice of obfuscation of issues versus pinpointing the challenges, such as a risk, threat, agenda setting. Do any of our presenters want to answer that?
Can you repeat the question again?
Yes, indeed. So what is your vision on the usage of the concepts by the movie makers? So the practice of obfuscation of issues versus pinpointing the challenges, such as a risk or threat of the agenda setting.
You mean movie makers, people who make movies?
That's how I'm reading it. That's how I'm understanding it here. But Alexander, would you like to confirm that's what you meant? Is it sort of producers of movies that is being referred to? I believe so. We could go in and answer that.
No, I think there's a really important question, because what it points to is also the power of concepts in popular culture, right? So sometimes we think that concepts are something that, we use as academics, or as I suggested, is something that we see among sort of social movements, as sort of slogans or, political actors. But actually, the everyday use of concept, the everyday presence of concept is what really shapes our understanding of them. So looking also at concepts in popular culture, whether that's movies, so visual representations, or in books, or also in all kinds of arts, and in other ways, I think is hugely important, including architecture. I think thinking about the aesthetics of certain architecture, certain buildings, clearly concepts are ingrained, embedded, enshrined all around us. And I think it's very, very important to think about what do they show, what do they obscure, the agenda behind initiating or building a certain artifact, the message that a movie is trying to give us. And I think in that regard, opening students to the power of concepts, not just in sort of high theory or political practice, but also in the popular culture around us, I think is really important.
Can I add something there?
Sure.
Please.
I don't want to be the Indian guy talking about Bollywood, but I am actually, sort of working on and it's interesting you mention Alexander movies because in India, for instance, the third most successful movie financially that came out in December. It's called Dhurandhar, and it's about, this anti-terror agent from India going into Pakistan and, infiltrating their networks and, killing everyone, right? So it's sort of just this muscular nationalist movie. But what is fascinating about this and why I'm watching the second part of the movie tomorrow on the first day that it's being released in Copenhagen is that the way in which they're adopting this sort of Manichaean conception of the world that we saw, with the global war on terror, us versus the terrorists, is completely replicated, in this movie and in the way they construct the terrorist and the evil, so the actual color distinction may not be there, but the same racialized figure of the terrorist still has a lot of political and cultural capital. So yeah.
Tanya.
Tanya.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, I think that this is one of the really good assets of the book for the teaching is the conceptual web that Felix also already presented. And this could be an invitation for students like, okay, go and watch the movie and try and figure out what the conceptual web underlying the logic that is presented there is doing in the movie, right? So this really provides the students with a concrete tool to actually stimulate their own thinking and to bring this to take this to other examples not discussed in the book or other scenes and other because we don't discuss popular culture so much, but there is no reason to limit this just because the book doesn't discuss it. I think the book really provides a very powerful tool to enable the students to actually bring it into other sites themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think some of the chapters point to popular culture, but you're right. It's the tool to do that. Yeah. Fawzia, do we have another question?
Thank you. Yes, we actually have a question which came from one of the people who registered in advance. So I've got a couple of those that actually came in. So I want to move to one of those. So this question is, I'd be interested to know whether the panelists had any original ideas to share on how to access knowledge of concepts in the AI age. So they want to know about any of your ideas on how to access knowledge. How to assess knowledge of concepts in the AI age. Sorry.
Yeah, well, that is one of these questions where right now everything is about, okay, what does this mean in the age of AI? I'm not entirely sure whether AI is changing the way we should look at the power of concepts. I think what AI does is it creates another source, another medium, basically robots or algorithms or processes, softwares that create schemes for how we see things, how we read, and whether we think about text. When AI sort of generates texts, or whether AI creates visual worlds for us that we delve into. I think. I mean, I'm not an expert on the development of AI, but obviously concepts play a crucial role in the development of artificial intelligence. I think to ask the question on what concepts do we see and do we use analytically, politically, and how the emergence of artificial intelligence sort of changes those meanings is an important question that I don't have an answer to. It's a really important question you want to study. but I would think that it doesn't change the sort of tools that we have already to study the power of concepts. I think in terms of AI, it just adds another dimension on sort of the sources and who is shaping, who is using, and who is disseminating these concepts. But again, it's a really important question that I don't have a clear-cut answer to be honest.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And we actually have another question as well, and I think we have enough time to do this one, so I will just come into this one. So this question is, how do you distinguish ideas from concepts? Is there a substantive difference between history of ideas and your approach?
I'll let Tanya and Som come in a second, but just to be clear, so the book itself does very explicitly say that it is not a book on the history of ideas or the history of concepts, which is, of course, an entire discipline in the humanities. But having said that, each chapter actually is sort of providing a sort of historical emergence section where it looks at sort of the story of where and how did the concept enter the discipline of international relations. So in that sense, each of the authors are very much aware that each concept has a history and that there are different ways of studying this history. But if we would turn these chapters into, or the book into a project of conceptual history, we would have, like Koselleck, we would end up, with a multi-year and multi-volume project. So the book really focuses on the contemporary use. However, there are chapters such as the ones on colonialism, for instance, I can think of, that very clearly focus on how the concept was used historically and how also the history of colonialism still shapes the way international relations and politics are conducted today. So there is clearly a historical dimension in each of these chapters, but it is not the main focus. Now, the connection between concept and ideas and to what extent your chapters are only covering ideas is something that I would leave to Tanya and Som to maybe answer. Because clearly, I think you're not just looking at ideas, you're looking at practices too, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So in my chapter, I do go a little bit into the historical uses or mobilization of sovereignty, but not in a proper historical genealogical way, but just to still show how it was mobilized historically. And I think by showing the different dimensions and the work that the concepts do, and again also the how they are built through these conceptual webs, makes it something else than just ideas or different ideologies, right? We really show the work that these concepts do. So I would, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, but I think all the chapters are really, are really focusing on these concepts and the conceptual work that they do.
Yeah. I think some that particular came through in the examples that you gave, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the same thing. I mean, my chapter does go through sort of a history of how the concept of race has been used, and not just, also within international relations. But I think that bringing in those histories and experiences and legacies into the word or the concept of race, I think it is a way of showing, again, going back to Felix, what you said, that concepts are a political tool. How we use it, where we use it, taps back to these certain histories, legacies, structures, experiences. And if we recognize that, then it becomes our students become much more cognizant of where you use it and why you use it and what that allows us to see, right? So if we look at those, and that's why it was, really nice to work with this chapter where we, of course, started, where I started off with Black Lives Matter, but then, I was able to also show its relevance to the migration crisis versus, say, the global war on terror, to show sort of, the
Yeah. And I think in that regard, I mean, both of your chapters and actually all of them actually nicely show the connection between ideas and political practice. And I think this is, I mean, if you take sovereignty, right? I mean, sovereignty is an idea, yes, but sovereignty is practiced every day, everywhere, right? At the border, at the way we think about how political authority works, and so forth. So the actual physical, tangible, material expression of the idea is all around us. And this is really, I think, what the book is doing. And I think all the chapters point to that connection. So we're not just talking about sort of mental frameworks, which concepts are, but we're talking about how they're put to use, not just by academics, but in the real world by political practitioners. And so in that sense, I think the book very nicely, yes, makes the point that concepts are an entry point into understanding our abstract thinking about the world, but also about very concrete, very tangible practices that, leave an imprint on people's lives.
Thank you very much for answering that question for our audience. And we are actually out of time now. We've gone later than advertised, so I will say we should move to the next slide and we can kind of wrap up the session.
Yep.
So this will all we have time for, but if you have asked the question that we didn't get around to, we will try to follow up afterwards. Don't forget to visit our webpage, and you'll see that on the next slide. To find out more about the textbook, concepts in international relations.
Can I just one before we go to the last slide? Can I just make one last very important note on closing our webinar, and that is that what we want students also to do and to see is to contest taken for granted meanings. So in many ways, what the book is doing is it shows that concepts are not just real and tangible, not just ideas, but that we have different readings of them and that they're contested. So that contestedness, which is really what also politics then is about, and where we see that in world politics is not a space in which we all agree what sovereignty is, how race should be understood, and so forth. So the contestation of concepts is really what also I think makes the book so valuable, because students can really see this in every chapter and across the chapters. Yeah, sorry, Fawzia, but I just wanted to make that point because I think it's an important message that the book is trying to kind of convey. Yeah.
Absolutely, no, thank you. And I think anybody who would like to see a copy of that book themselves, you can either buy a copy with a 25% discount using the code that you can see on screen, SAGE AUTH25, or if you are a lecturer or a module leader, you can request an electronic inspection copy from our webpage for free. And so we'll be sending a webinar link to you by email over the next few days, so you can watch this again or share it with any of your colleagues who may be interested. Once again, thank you to Felix, to Sandeep, to Tanya for your time today and the very engaging and insightful presentation and panel discussion. And thank you also to Amy for co-hosting our Q&A box and all the technical support behind the scenes. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. Goodbye.